but he wasn't a big kid from the pictures I see. He might have been 5'7". He might have been 150 pounds, 170 pounds. And they picked his body, and they used it as his head as a battering ram, trying to bust open the gates before they had gotten the key. So this guy, they rammed his head so many times, and then they left him laying there.
That was William Quinn, 27 years old, a correctional officer at Attica. September 9th, 1971. What happened next is why Rick Harcrow spent 37 years working those walls.
That's what the problem with the general public. They cannot fathom some of the heinous crimes these criminals do. Yeah. You tell them stories, they think you're making it up. I said, I think they used to say, I forget what the total number of inmates we had in this country, 300 grand, don't quote me. And I said, yeah, we could have double that, but we can't afford to keep them in prison. Unfortunately, small parts of our society is extremely violent. And people don't understand that. When we talk about those to the inmates, I said, these inmates kill their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters, their children, their neighbors. How could you think the cops are the bad guys?
I first want to welcome our special guest today, Rick Harcrow. He's a 37-year veteran correctional officer. And the topic of the day is one of the most defining moments in American correctional history. It's the Attica Prison Riot. It occurred over 4 days in September of 1971. And Rick is here to help us remember that tragic moment, but that defining moment, really. It changed so much about how we handle corrections in this country today. 43 people died in the Attica Prison Riot. It was the deadliest prison riot in American history. All right, 33 of those who died were inmates who were part of the rioting. 10, though, were correctional officers and civilian employees of the Attica Correctional Facility. And I want to start by just reading the names of the 7 correctional officers who made the ultimate sacrifice in September of 1971 at Attica. William E. Quinn, Correction Sergeant Edward T. Cunningham, John J. DiArcangelo Jr., Richard J. Lewis, Ronald D. Werner, Harrison W. Whalen, and Carl W. Vallone. All of those made the ultimate sacrifice in the name of public safety. You know, when I was leading the effort to build the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial and the National Law Enforcement Museum, one of the things that I wanted to make sure we did right was to honor and remember the members of our correctional community. They are such an important part of law enforcement in this country, and yet underappreciated. All right, often unrecognized for the work they do because they do it behind these walls where most people never come in contact with them except the criminals in our country. So today we're going to talk about corrections, and we're going to talk to Rick Harcrow, who's been behind the walls of Attica as a correctional officer for 30 years, 3 decades. All right, he knows what goes on behind those walls. He wasn't there when this riot occurred in 1971, but he worked in the shadow of that event, that very tragic event, dark day in American history. And he knows the stories, he knows the people that served there, and the families of those who died there. And today, Rick, I can't tell you how pleased and honored we are to have joining me and my co-host, Bill Erfurth, to talk about Attica, but also to talk about corrections in general. What happened after Attica? What reforms occurred? What's it like to be a correctional officer in America today? And these are some of the key topics we're going to get into in detail. But let me start with a question to kind of help bring some context to what actually happened in September of 1971 at Attica. Take us back there. What was the facility like? Where is Attica, first of all? Maybe help everybody understand that. And the inmates that were housed there, are these the worst of the worst? Help us understand the inmate population at Attica at the time.
All right, give me 1 second. Attica was a maximum security prison. It was supposed to be a disciplinary prison, meaning that an inmate who couldn't get along, and I'll name some New York State prisons, in other New York State prisons, Auburn, Sing Sing, Clinton. If you lived in this state, you know the names. They would bring them here. They would bring them to Attica. And it wasn't any more severe discipline. It was swift. So if a guy made a mistake, assaulted somebody, caused a disturbance, we immediately take them to admin segregation. What the public likes to do is solitary confinement. It's no such thing as solitary confinement. It's the same cell in all the other cell blocks, and they get all the services everybody else does. But these are inmates that have proven themselves to assault staff, assault inmates, cause disturbances. And it's approximately, timers just say 1% of the population. And it was an excellent program. It contained the bad guys, or the ones that wouldn't conform to prison rules or regulation. And it was a much needed tool. Usually after 3 months, 6 months, a year, depending on the severity, most of them would learn their lesson and then conform to prison population. But there were some that the real bad guys, the 1% of 1%, that sometimes stayed up there their whole career. And it was the 70s. And they told us, times were turbulent. There was a lot of rebellion or upheaval across the nation. And some correction officers who were very sharp guys, the media portrays us as big, dumb thugs. Nothing could be the truth. Could be further from the truth. These were some pretty sharp, street smart people who knew how to handle a population like that. And we talked a lot more than we ever used physical force. Thank God. Because when we got there was approximately 600 officers and there was 2,200 inmates, right? So whoever would win that fight, let's break it down. 6 guys against 20 guys. Who's going to win? COs lose. So they knew. And after that riot, it was terrible working conditions for the inmates. They were locked down. They were at like 5:30 at night. I think there was no access to newspapers or TVs or radio. So
this is after the riot you're talking about?
That was before the riot. That were the conditions
before the riot.
that led up to the riot. That was there. They got like one roll of toilet paper a month, and the department is very bureaucratic, even today. The officers would try to explain to the bosses, and they would just tell, hey, that's the rules. That's the way it is. So we would kind of bend the rules a little bit to make it work, and they had just had enough. And the officers knew that there was going to be a problem, and the union leaders knew. We were a union state. And they went to the
What were the warning signs? You
know what? The inmate population, like police on the street, I'm sure your friend Bill will tell us a lot of information. And most of them want to do their time and go home, right? The smarter ones out of them. And there's plenty of them. And they'll tell you they made a mistake. They would come to us and say, hey, you guys got to do something. There's going to be a disturbance. Nobody knew there was going to be a riot of this magnitude. But the officers, supervisors, union people went to the superintendents. The superintendents, the ex-wardens back in the day for the public, were almost like gods in their prison, The warden will say, it's hot out today. You can remove your jackets, officers. Now, we get some pretty hot summers up here in Western New York. You imagine we used to wear the old blazers and the Ike jackets and all that. That's how tough it was. Well, when they went to the superintendent said, and I quote, inmates would never do that in my prison. They would never riot. Now, in court, they tell you there's hearsay. No, I had an old Sergeant Cunningham, was no relation to the Sergeant Cunningham that was killed in the middle of the riot. And when I was a rookie union leader, he pulled me aside and we were trying to make a settlement. He said, Richard, I want you to know You could subpoena me in court. He's since deceased. He said, I went to the superintendent along with a lot of other officers and officials here and told him there's going to be a riot. You got to lock this place down. And the superintendent refused to. And, years later, I had a conversation with a sharp superintendent. He said, well, what would you want me to do? I said, well, in the prison system, this is our policy. We lock up the bad guys. We do an investigation. We figure out who they are. And then we split them up. If there's 5 bad guys ready to cause a problem, we send them to 5 different maximum security jails all across the state. Hopefully that they never meet up again to do it again. That's basically their prison policy. I used to argue, hey, make a lockdown unit, keep them in there for 5-10 years. So, go ahead.
So, Rick, you were at Attica, and at that time, and you mentioned there's 2,200 inmates.
Right.
So is that population, or is that overcrowded? Is that part of the whole situation?
Someone told me the place was supposed to run about 1,200 inmates. And they never got to that number. They were about 1,700. I believe there was about 1,600 there that day. When I was there the whole time, the prison crowding with the crack epidemic went through the roof, and we had 2,200 all the time. That was the max fill.
So it's a little crowded, and it's a little heated probably. So you're boots on the ground there.
Right.
What did you start feeling when you're hearing this about, there's going to be an uprising, there's going to be a problem? What's the mood? What are you guys feeling?
You know what? When I got there, it was 12 years later. I was, 13 years later, excuse me. I was 12 years old when the riot went in 71. So I got there in 1984. And because of the history, a lot of these officers were young. They were still there. And they explained to us, they said, listen, normally the inmate, a prison moves around like a little town, like a little city, like a little college campus. People see the movies, they're locked up 24 hours a day, and we throw bread and water at them, and laugh at them. No, that's nothing further from the truth. We got in on day shift 7 in the morning. We opened up the cells about 8. We fed a morning chow, took about an hour. Then we brought them back. We would feed about half the prison population, I think. Half of them would like to eat in their cells. So, but then they go on and they go to the programs. They can go to school. They can go to medical visits. They can go to different recreation. So they come out. We have work sites. We had a core craft. We built metal lockers and beds and desks for the state. So it was like a little city. Most of them were out. Most of them were out all day long. They didn't go back in until 10 o'clock at night. They would come back about 3 o'clock, shift change. We'd lock some in. We'd leave some in programs. And the next shift comes on and we open it back up again. Do a count at 7 in the morning. We did a count at 5. And then we did a count at like 10 o'clock for the day shift, day and afternoon. But they were out most of the day. And first time I went to mess hall, we had 2 major mess halls back then, hosted about 400 people. Just to show you, I was 24 years old. I worked at General Motors for a year in an engine plant up here. I've been around a little bit. 6 foot 210. I could handle myself. First time I walked in that mess hall, it was probably 300-400 inmates. I thought there was 4,000 inmates in there. I thought I was in a football stadium looking at the end zone. Scared to death. When we talk, if you ain't scared to death in a maximum security prison, then you're either lying or a fool. And we've had the memorial. Attica's imposing, right? It's big 30-foot brick walls.
I believe it was the morning of September 9th, I believe,
yes.
1971, yes. When this riot occurred. And to me, it almost seemed unplanned. I mean, you've described warning signals. There were a lot of complaints about the conditions for the inmates, and so they were unhappy. But it seems to me, what I know about the Attica Prison Riot is that it was unplanned. They weren't necessarily saying, okay, on September 9th, 1971, we're going to riot. But there was a triggering event. Something happened that morning that just blew it wide open. And now all of a sudden, prisoners were taking over the facility. It's unbelievable that it happened. What was the triggering event, and how did the prisoners get control over the correctional officers?
You're not going to believe this story, but it is true. Last 11 years of my career, I did transportation. So I took inmates to courts, hospitals, transferred them to other prisons. So we would get an inmate in a van all by himself, and he could tell us anything he wanted to. We didn't ask. But people are people everywhere. And they just tell you their story. Oh. Incident started in a hallway on the way back from the mess hall, morning breakfast. And normally they would run them back in the day right from the mess hall right out to the recreation yard, right? Well, they decided there was a problem the day before in this A block with an inmate. And they took him to ADSEG, special housing unit, we call it, SHU. Not solitary, just a special housing, so it's a lockdown cell block. And they were concerned about that. They wanted to go to the yard. And they said, no, you're going back to your cells. And they said, no, we're going to the yard. We have to walk down a hallway. Attica's split into 4 hallways, 4 separate blocks with 4 yards in the middle of that hallway in a square. And they said, no, we're going to the yard. And then it was on. Something happened. They jumped the officers, and it was on. And the old locking system, they have these big old bit keys if you're ever in prison. They're the size of 2 of your fingers, right? Big heavy-duty locks. The locks over the year had been worn. They got the keys off one of the gate officer, and they ran to the next gate. And we got a series of gates, best security I've ever seen. Everything's got a gate with a lock. So the officers had the gate locked, thought this is no problem. What are they going to do? When they shoved the key into the lock, the key opened the lock. The keys were so rolled down, so the key to the front door fit the back door when they were supposed to be different keys. Try to explain to you. And when that lock popped, they said, oh, damn, we're in trouble. And, we used to walk to the chow at the programs 40 at a time. So we marched them 2 by 2. So we had 20 guys lined up 2 by 2. There's 40. They were telling me sometimes they were so short back then, they'd run 80 or 120 to like a mess hall or program, which meant our yards were 100 yard by 100 yard. So the guys started leaving the cell block in A, 100 yards to the square, cut another 100 yards to the next mess hall. You wouldn't even see the front of your line. That's how many guys would be walking, So once they turned the corner and we had good security. Every position, corner, hallway, we always had someone watching. Whoever set it up really knew what they were doing back then. It was a built maximum security prison. In that corridor, they just jumped them. Now, to get back to my story, I'm taking a guy in a van, and he said he was in the prison for a long time for bad checks. Now, we normally can't look up their records unless we take them out somewhere. That's department policy. So we know if he's a bank robber or a murderer or a drug addict. And he said, yeah, I was there. There was a guy wearing a white helmet, and there was a fight in the yard the night before, and officers ran out there, and the lieutenant ran out there, and some kid, he said it was a white kid, it's a black inmate, not that matters. We were in the middle of a fight, bam, he knocked the head off a lieutenant. Well, that was ungodly. You don't use force against officers. That's just about as dumb as move as you can make. So they went to grab the kid, and they said, hey, that was an accident. That was an accident. What are you guys doing? What are you officers doing? Leave him alone. Leave him alone. And I think they left him there. And they left. Well, then that night, next day, they must have been talking about it. And I believe that kid was in that group of inmates coming back. And when they went to take him, the inmate said, nah, that's not happening. And that sparked allegedly the incident. I believe the guy. He had no reason to tell me a story.
So when I asked you earlier, though, just to back up, because when I asked you earlier, you worked with a lot of those guys.
Yes.
After the fact.
Yes.
And so when they shared those stories, when cops and law enforcement people sit around and they love to tell their war stories and stuff, right. I'm sure you heard some stories from these folks. And that was the premise of my question earlier was, what did they feel? Did they have any sense that that the climate was percolating there to explode?
Oh yes. Many officials, many officers, let me reiterate that. Yeah, went to the superintendent and told him to lock it down, and they refused to. Which was, now we think about hindsight's 2020. It was outrageous. You could have stopped the whole thing. There might have never been a riot. These officers do what they do. The problem today is a lot of agencies, corrections, they don't want to listen to the staff. I'm like, the staff know what they're doing. They used to tell us we ran one of the best prisons in the country. And we really did. We ran that like an Olympic sport. 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, they went to chow. 9 o'clock, the bosses would have fun once in a while. For lack of a better word, I was running the OM post between the two mess halls, and we're running 800 guys in and out, and we do it in an hour, which was phenomenal, like Marine precision. We used to tell them, we ain't got Marines here. I think we got crackheads here, this isn't like, we don't snap the fingers or all fall to attention. And we do an amazing job. If the chow went from 8 o'clock to 9:01 or 9:02, 9:03, we get a call from the watch commander. Hey, you know what you're doing down there? What's going on? He'd be just busting our chops to keep it running. I said, Lieutenant, we're doing the best we can, which was amazing. And they used to say in New York and all that. It was one of my superintendents said, we were the best running jails. We were organized, if I could say. And that's what them, after the fact, well, I'll get to your question, right? Everybody knew it. Yeah. And unfortunately, the day of the riot, a bunch of old timers called in sick, which I couldn't believe, but I could believe. We went there to work. We didn't go there to get killed.
Well, so they suspected that September 9th was going to be the day all hell broke loose?
Yeah. These inmates talking. They're good, man. They'll talk and they won't. They can't say a word because, like we said, aren't they afraid of the officers? No, not really. They've been through the court system. They've been through the law. They've been with the police. They've been arrested. They know we have to treat them civilly. So, they're not afraid. But the other inmates will stab and kill them to death and burn them to death. I was in Auburn as a rookie and they told me, kid, you don't want to go to Attica. You asked about the different prisons I was in. Well, it started off Attica in 1984 was on lockdown. September, I went to the academy and they said, you go to 2 weeks to your local jail where you're going to work someday and they train you on the job training. Then they send you where they need you. So we used to go to Sing Sing or Greenhaven, the downstate facilities near New York. Well, they wouldn't send us to Sing Sing, Attica, so I had to go to Elmira. Great bunch of jail with a great bunch of officers. Most were. And then I went to Sing Sing, was my first real duty station. And then they got to bounce back. On the way back, I hit Auburn. And then I showed up at Attica about 9 months later.
Yeah. Well, let me get back to the riot now.
Yes.
So one of the things that I think us civilians don't understand or appreciate is that you're outnumbered by the inmates by a lot, as you've described. And, somebody would say, well, if an inmate started a riot or attacked one of the correctional officers, wouldn't you just pull your weapon and shoot them, right? Use whatever force is necessary. But in a correctional facility, and help us understand this, the correctional officers, most of them anyway, do not carry weapons. Is that correct? At least not firearms.
No. Yeah. Inside the prison back in the day, the only thing we had up to a few years ago was a 26-inch baton, wooden baton that we carried on us. It wasn't the side handle baton you see on TV. It was just a plain wooden 26-inch, inch and a quarter around. That was your only weapon. We didn't have pepper spray. We didn't have any firearms. The only firearms we have in that prison is the exterior wall and the interior yards. And then in the mess halls, we had automatic gas. Well, later on, we got automatic gas systems. In the early years, they had a guy up there with the old 240Z gas gun, a tear gas gun. And if anything went off, he would pop the rounds into the mess hall or in the yard. We had the gas guns, and we had the rifle, shotgun, and a sidearm.
So the important point you're making is that it would not be all that difficult for hundreds of prisoners to overtake a few correctional officers, and that's exactly what happened at the Attica Prison Riot, that they took control. They decided enough is enough. We're not going to tolerate all the unfair conditions they believed that existed. And so now they've taken the correctional officers hostage, and this began a 4-day ordeal. Talk to us about the hostages. Now they're taking the correctional officers and some of the civilian employees hostage into the big yard. And how do they treat those hostages? I mean, the inmates, as you described, some of them are murderers, rapists. I imagine that they didn't treat those hostages very nicely.
No. We back up a little bit. When they took the square, Times Square was the middle of the prison where the four hallways meet. We got four gates to each A block, B block, C block, and D block. They took that square. That was a real bad inmate that was a cop killer. I'm not going to mention his name. He killed a couple sheriffs and his fellow inmate on a transport and had blamed it on the inmate. So he comes to Attica Prison. He's a bad guy. He's killed two sheriff deputies, his fellow inmate. They think they killed him so they could shut him up and blame everything on him, his fellow inmate. So he gets there with a bunch of guys, and they decide to grab poor Bill Quinn. Bill Quinn was 27 years old, Irish, but he wasn't a big kid from the pictures I seen. He might have been 5'7". He might have been 150 pounds, 170 pounds, and he laid somewhere in that prison for 2 days. Finally, inmates brought him up to the front by a gate to try to get him out because they knew if this guy died, they could all be charged with felony murder. All conspiracy, what would you call it? The co-conspirators or, criminals, fellow criminals charged with it. Well, then they found out he died on the news media. Found out this poor guy. And they had hidden I don't want to say John, and they went looking for them too and found him in a cell. So them inmates, at first they wanted to kill the hostages, some of them, and the rest of them said, no, you can't, because then we'll all be charged with murder. So
over a few. It really started out as a riot because they were so displeased with the conditions. They've had enough, so they decide to riot, and they're not going to obey the rules anymore. But then nobody went in right away. All right, so this is perhaps the biggest, in hindsight, one of the biggest mistakes that was made. Instead of going in immediately to rescue the hostages and to retake control of the prison facility, the inmates were allowed to negotiate. They began a negotiation process with the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller at the time, with the corrections commissioner of the state of New York, and they had these demands that they wanted met. And in the end, I guess amnesty was their biggest demand. They didn't want to be blamed or punished for what had happened. And yet, as you point out, and I think that's a good segue, Bill Quinn died. And the inmates learned that he had died. And basically, that was the end of negotiations as we knew it. The governor was unwilling, I think, to grant amnesty to the prisoners. Right. And as a result, they decided to retake control of the facility 4 days after the inmates had taken over the facility. And that's when all hell broke loose. Maybe you could describe what happened at that point and how it ended, which was terribly, tragically. And, it was really an ill-fated and ill-planned retaking of the facility that ended in most of these 43 deaths.
Yes. From the stories I was told, after the initial riot, in a riot, like the first hour is the worst. That's the most violent. That's the most, for anybody listening out there, police, cops, correction officers, when you hear glass breaking, it's the real deal. That means they're busting the place up. They're so angry and mad. They're busting everything up, start locking down, start calling alarms. We had an old antiquated phone system. You couldn't cut in a phone like you could today, So guys were trying to call to see what was going on and didn't even know half of what was going on. Like in the back of the prison, the metal shops we have, the core craft facilities, other blocks, didn't even know what was happening. Then the officers, they took back 3/4 of that prison and had them all out in one yard. I don't know if it was the yard where they ended up or not. But then somehow the powers that be got a hold in Albany, and Albany said, back off. And then they had to back off the officers, and they took back over. This went out 3 or 4 days, became a circus. They brought in a Black Panther guy. They brought in some famous newspaper people, reporters. They brought in a local politician on their behalf. And even Oswald, the commissioner, I believe Oswald was the commissioner, and Mancusi, I believe, don't quote me, was the prison superintendent. He went to the yard to talk to him. I would have never went in that yard. In 37 years, I had an excellent reputation as an officer. No way I'm going in that yard, And they tried. And when they wanted amnesty, they said, no, you can't get amnesty. The officer died. So when they busted up that prison pretty good, we had big locking mechanisms, are big steel doors. Still today, we had pickaxes where they tried to break through and they couldn't. So they sat there for 4 days, and these hostages would say, the state was very quiet, like normal conventional wisdom, right? Keep everything quiet on duty. But they told me they would come up to them and can of kerosene, you ready to die? Ready to go now? And we're going to light you up. They'd light a lighter, show them the can of kerosene. We're going to come get you. And finally, a group, they claim it was a certain group, I don't want to give them any credos, said, we got to protect these guys. Otherwise, we're all going to get charged. So they kept the other inmates at bay for 4 days. And then finally, there's a police captain out there, state police. They just went to him and said, hey, end this, take it over. And he wrote, I think his name was Monahan. He wrote a good article years ago. He said, basically, if I remember correctly, they just dumped it in my lap, said, take this place back. And they wanted the governor to come, but the political end of it is what we hear on the street is that he wanted to be president, vice president, thought it would look bad if he showed up, so he wouldn't show up. And then they just turned to the state police and said, take it over. The state police and the correction officers, some of them, they didn't have enough guns. Some correction officers came in with their own guns. I understand. And they got them in 1 yard. Now, the yards are 100 by 100 yards square. Right? And there's a baseball diamond, a basketball, a handball court, whatever else was in their bathroom. And whoever advised this plan, I couldn't believe. They had the snipers on the roof. And I would have thought these guys just came back from Nam. They had to be good, some of these state police guys. I'm sure they were proficient. They decided to bring this Huey helicopter in. I'll send you a picture of it. Somebody got a picture of it going over the wall, and they dropped the gas into the yard. Well, there was so much gas, it was like a bed sheet. My wife turned the light on. Is it better? Is it better or worse? All right, so they had it was like a bed sheet. There was so much gas hanging in front of you. And then somehow they had the officers up on these catwalks, the hallways, the top, with knives at their throat. Someone said somehow they thought they were cutting their throats. Once somebody shot, we don't know who. Then it was a guy wrote a book like Turkey Shoot. Everybody shot. And this rounds, if you look up, you might be able to find it on the internet. They shot for approximately 30, 40 seconds. It sounded like the 4th of July. Boom, 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 boom. But that's only been 3 seconds. Imagine 30, 40 more. Boom, 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 boom. And the judge actually ruled, my friends might say I'm wrong, you shot 1,500 rounds, I believe it was. Don't quote me on the number. It's out there. In 100 by 100 yard with hundreds of people in there. You had to know people were going to die. Right? And he ruled excessive force, and that was his reason. So
that was after the fact. But, what we're talking about is, Bill Quinn, the correctional officer who was used as the battering ram, unbelievable. Right. I had not heard that story. He was the only correctional officer to die during the takeover, right? And then we had, I think, 3 inmates that were actually murdered, stabbed 20 times or more by other inmates during the takeover. But really, when we're talking about 43 deaths, okay, that means 39 of them died during this retaking of the correctional facility. And that's where all the criticism came later on. I mean, obviously, 2020 hindsight is, easy to second guess what happened and criticize the people making the decisions. But as you point out, they had to know people were going to die, even correctional officers that were being held hostage. There had to be a better way, a better plan to retake that facility. And it didn't happen that way. And here we are, 30 some years later. 55 years. Yeah, I was thinking of the number of deaths, but 55 years later, and it's easy to look back and say, well, they screwed that up big time. But, 6 correctional officers died during the retaking, some 30 some inmates. It was really a sad day in correctional history.
If you look
And
back at one of the documentaries, Sergeant Cunningham, I worked with three of his sons. They were great guys. He was a sharp sergeant. He was out in the middle of the yard, and they had a film crew out there, and he told them, he said, "Hey, Governor, and you people, this is serious. People are going to get killed here. You need to come here and resolve this." And it was chilling because that poor man was killed days later. Sergeant Edward Cunningham. And his sons were top shelf COs. One was a sergeant, one was a lieutenant. I knew them as officers, you know.
Rick, you mentioned this earlier, and you're talking about, you've got the worst of the worst and some extremely dangerous people that are inside these prisons, right? So as you're telling this story and how it unfolds, you've got some folks in there that are murderers, serial killers, serial criminals, whatever they may be. And they don't give a shit. They don't give a shit if they kill you. They don't give a shit if they kill another inmate. They didn't care. I am sure, just like you said, the dynamics of all that is some of the smarter inmates that had half a brain cell perhaps started to realize that, well, we just can't randomly kill everybody. If we want to negotiate, we got to keep these people alive as hostages.
That's a tool.
As a tool, yeah. And then I'm sure some of the other, vicious killers, they didn't care. It's not like they're going to stay in prison any longer. So some of those inmates, like you said, you were transporting some guy that was, in there for fraud. He doesn't want to get a murder charge hung on him because he's probably going to be out soon. But some of those other guys, you're dealing with ruthless fucking animals, basically, that would kill anyone. Right. Yeah. And it's funny because you dealt with them on the inside. I dealt with them on the outside. And anybody that's dealt with these kind of people understand that they would kill, just like you said, they'd kill their mother,
others,
grandmother, at a drop of a hat. I went to a call where one brother killed the other brother because he ate the last frickin' pork chop. So it's the mentality that you're dealing with. And we have a big problem in this country, and you kind of hit on it earlier. The people just don't get it. They just don't understand. And then they want to vilify law enforcement for taking action against somebody that's a ruthless animal. And as well as I know, there's only one language that these people understand. If you say to them, "Excuse me, sir, please step over here," they look at you like you're speaking Chinese. But if you tell them, "Step the fuck over here before I knock your ass out," now you're communicating on their wavelength. And that's the only thing that these people understand is violence, because that's their whole life.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. I had a friend who was a lobbyist. She was from Oxford University. She was a Rhodes Scholar. She worked for some national corrections group. And I told her one day, we were talking all about smartest, worldliest person I ever met. She said it plain and simple. Some people in the world, Richard, just don't get it. They just don't get it. Extreme violent criminals need to be in a secure location, prison. Now, they've gone to other countries and looked at, like Norway. They got about 3-4 star rooms for these guys. I'm like, are you kidding me? This is what you want to build them? No. And we ran, and even back then, it was a humane system. We gave them decent food. We gave them decent clothing. They wore work uniforms. They could have some private after the riot. They got some conditions that were better. They could have books. They could have newspapers, stuff they complained about. They didn't have no contact with the outside world. Later on, they got TVs. One good thing in New York, they actually used to make them pay for them. Now, I don't think that's anymore. And like I said, well, if they want to buy them, okay. But I'm not giving nobody, as a John Q citizen, a 5-star hotel to stay in when they're committing heinous acts. And I believe in rehabilitation for the ones, teach them to get up in the morning, go to work, have a living, But I don't believe in giving people 5-star accommodations.
I want to ask you I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you a question about, mindset and your mindset in taking that job. And let's just do a comparison.
Right.
When I went to work and I do an 8-hour, 10-hour shift, I could go to a nice restaurant to eat. I could interact and talk with people that were
Normal.
Normal, law-abiding people that appreciated you. And then part of the time I'm dealing with freaking animals. But if you're a corrections officer, you don't get that luxury. You're dealing with freaking animals 24/7. 24/7. And what is the mindset to say, you know what, I'm going to work in a prison and get locked inside a facility with some of the biggest pieces of shit of society?
Well, in the early 80s, the recession was on, and I worked for General Motors from a year for like 79 to 80. I'm terrible on dates for a year. Then we got laid off. It was terrible recession, 2 to 3 years. I lived in Buffalo, New York. You couldn't buy a job in Buffalo, right? These government job came up. My father, God rest his soul, was a combat Marine. He said, I don't know if you want to do this, son, but look at this. So I see the ad in the paper, career with a pension, a healthcare plan. It was low pay back then. We boosted up a little bit. Still ain't what it should be, but there was nothing else to do. And he said, I don't know. I said, you know what, Dad, I'll take the job. If you do the background check and go to the academy, pass the physicals and all that, it's a lot more involved, as you know, than just walking and getting a job as a cashier at a supermarket. I said, if the job's, I'm not on no suicide mission. If it's really bad, I'll do the academy and then I'll quit. And I can tell you, walking into that prison at 24 years old, and I remember this, you talk about, I don't have no PSTD because I worked with a great, excellent group of officers because of the history and because of the whereabouts and the action, the murder and mayhem. You got to count on each other. I liken it to combat soldiers. They know they got to work together, whether they're black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Jewish, Catholic, all the various cultures in America. And I think that's why they were the greatest generation. Well, we got to the prison. We got country boys, city boys, and you hear my accent. The old country boys are going, put this guy in a cell. How the hell did he get a uniform? And I'm like, hey, you guys are real funny, okay? I'm a Sicilian. What can I say? All right, I'm an officer. And, you're right. The only good people in the prison are the staff, and then you have the various, like we said, one staggering statistic, I figured it was I had a vice president, God rest his soul, was a sharp guy. We got elected one term statewide presidency. We wanted a stronger union. And he pulled the figures. He said, do you realize in every max in New York State, the average inmate, medium, well, first off, let me go medium, minimum, medium, maximum. That's how we classify them. Has 4 to 7 prior felony convictions. 4 to 7 prior felonies. Most people don't know what that is. I would have a webpage. I put felonies out there: murder, rape, armed robbery, extreme physical assault, stabbings. Most people don't understand that. And I said, yeah. And now today, my parole buddies told me it's like 9 to 12, Rick. Because they've let out all the better inmates. But
those are just the ones that they got caught for.
Right. 45 to 50% of the inmates in a max jail back in 2002, 2005, I want to be clear, that's when we pull the figures, 45, almost 50% were doing time for murder or manslaughter. So to break it down in layman's terms, and I appreciate this podcast, half the people there, 2,200, about 1,000 people, murdered somebody or killed somebody to get there. Back then, the murder was, planned, for lack of going into a legalese. And manslaughter was me and you got in a bar fight and I killed you.
About 1,000 of those 2,200 men at Attica got there by taking a life. In part 2, Rick Harcrow takes us deeper. The inmate who looked him in the eye and said he'd be dead before the day was out. The violence the department tried to bury, and what 10,000 corrections officers finally did to force the state to listen. Part 2 with Rick Harcrow is next. Subscribe to Heroes Behind the Badge so you don't miss it.